The ground didn't shake, it roared. One German soldier later wrote that when the American 240mm howitzers, nicknamed the Black Dragons, opened fire, it felt as if the earth itself was being ripped apart. For years, Germany had trusted its fortresses, Monte Cassino, the Siegfried Line, and countless reinforced bunkers, to be untouchable, invincible castles of steel and concrete. But when the U.S. rolled these massive siege guns into position, firing 360-pound shells that could punch through 6 feet of reinforced concrete and leave craters 50 feet wide, everything changed. 14 miles away, Allied observers whispered coordinates, and then silence, until the Black Dragon spoke. 1 shell turned bunkers into graves. 2 turned fortresses into dust. German records describe soldiers abandoning positions, not because they were defeated, but because they couldn't imagine surviving another shot. And in those moments, as concrete shattered, steel bent, and centuries of defensive doctrine evaporated under raw American firepower, one truth echoed across the battlefield: this weapon didn't just break walls, it broke the will to resist. It was late 1944, and Europe was bleeding. The Allies had clawed their way across France after the breakout from Normandy, but now they stood at the doorstep of Germany, facing the looming brutal reality of the Siegfried Line, a network of fortified bunkers, Dragon's Teeth tank obstacles, minefields, and reinforced positions that Adolf Hitler believed would halt any invasion of the fatherland. Snow covered the forests of Western Europe, the air stank of cordite and frozen mud, and the war had entered a new phase. Not fast-moving maneuver, but grinding, merciless siege. The German defenders, stretched thin but still fiercely determined, fought from bunkers carved into hillsides and emplacements, built with 3 to 6 feet of reinforced concrete. These weren't temporary defenses. They were built to last generations. Many in the Wehrmacht believed that no artillery in the world could crack them. But across the Allied lines, a weapon was being prepared, piece by piece, slowly, deliberately, because it was too massive to transport assembled. It belonged to battalions like the 991st and 981st Field Artillery, commanded by officers who understood the physics of destruction, as well as the moral weight of using a weapon capable of reshaping Earth itself. Among them were officers like Lieutenant Colonel James H. Polk, whose calm efficiency and near-obsessive precision made him one of the most respected artillery leaders in the European theater. The crews worked with a kind of reverence. The weapon demanded it. The M1 240mm howitzer, known to those who served it as the Black Dragon, was more than artillery. It was an engine of demolition. It required cranes to emplace, tractors to tow, and crews trained to measure calculations down to the millimeter. Every shell weighed 360 pounds, large enough that a single mishandling could break bones or crush a man. Yet despite its size, this weapon wasn't wasteful or reckless. It was almost elegant. Observers, perched miles ahead with binoculars and radios, directed fire with cold precision. A bunker spotted at 12.4 miles, range calculated, wind measured, elevation set, powder charge loaded, breech sealed, and then silence. For a moment the battlefield paused as if the world itself inhaled. Then came the shot. A thunderclap louder than anything else on the front line. The earth shuddered, birds scattered from treetops miles away, and the massive projectile arced through the frozen sky, before crashing down with apocalyptic force. When it hit, men reported the ground shaking hundreds of meters from impact. German officers wrote that their soldiers froze, not because they were ordered to, but because instinct told them that movement meant death. At Monte Cassino earlier that same year, the Black Dragon had already carved its name into history. German paratroopers there were elite, hardened, and unshakable, but when the massive shells slammed into the mountainside, smashing fortifications built by centuries of workmanship, one soldier wrote, it felt like the mountain was collapsing. The monastery moved. And across the continent, from the rubble of Sicily to the defenses of the Rhineland, the psychological effect was the same: fear. Not fear of enemy soldiers, not fear of tanks. Fear of a weapon so overwhelmingly powerful that no wall, no bunker, no engineering, no matter how carefully designed, could stand against it. That fear wasn't accidental. It was the unspoken advantage of American industry and logistics, because the United States didn't just build one of these guns. It built 315, and it didn't ration ammunition. It produced 500,000 shells, more than some nations produced rifle rounds. Every shot meant fewer infantry lost in close assaults, fewer young men dying charging machine gun nests, fewer towns turned to killing grounds. The Black Dragon wasn't just a tool of destruction, it was a tool of survival. This story matters because it marks the moment fortified warfare, something humanity had relied on since castles and stone walls, became obsolete in the face of industrial firepower. It's worth hearing because it reminds us that wars are not won only by courage, rifles, or strategy, but sometimes by the sheer, undeniable force of innovation and will. And because to the men inside those bunkers it represented a singular, terrifying realization: they were no longer safe, not even underground. This is the story of the weapon that shattered Germany's confidence and crushed its fortresses. The US 240mm howitzer, the Black Dragon. Before the thunder of the Black Dragons ever echoed across Europe, the war had already taken a brutal turn. By mid-1944, after the breakout from Normandy and the liberation of Paris, the Allies had momentum, but they were nowhere near victory. The German army, though battered, was far from broken. The terrain ahead was unlike the open fields of France. It was dense forest, rugged hills, and defensive terrain Germany had spent years preparing. Hitler's generals knew the Reich couldn't match American production forever, so they pinned their hopes on defense, and the heart of that defense was the Siegfried Line, a chain of more than 18,000 fortifications, bunkers, pillboxes, tank traps, underground command posts, tunnels, and artillery shelters stretching hundreds of miles. It wasn't just concrete and steel. It was doctrine, pride, and a psychological barrier. German propaganda bragged that not even God could break it. To breach it by infantry alone meant suicide. Families across Europe already knew the names of brutal battles like Hurtgen Forest, where soldiers fought in cold rain under trees that exploded into lethal splinters under artillery fire. Men froze at night and bled during the day. The fog hung thick enough to swallow sound, and the air stank of cordite, pine, and bodies. Yet despite all of this suffering, the line still held. German mortar crews, machine gunners, and hardened paratroopers, Fallschirmjäger, hid behind reinforced walls, sometimes 4 feet thick, confident nothing the Allies possessed could reach them. Even American 155mm artillery, the workhorse of the front, could only scar the outer layer of these structures. Infantry units advancing toward these bunkers found themselves crawling through mud, barbed wire, and minefields under interlocking machine gun fire. Weeks passed, casualties mounted, and progress stalled. The message was painfully clear: firepower smaller than a sledgehammer wasn't enough. You needed something closer to a wrecking ball. Enter the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Watervliet Arsenal, and the heavy artillery battalions formed for one purpose: breaking the unbreakable. Among them was the 991st Field Artillery Battalion, commanded by calm, precise officers like Lieutenant Colonel James H. Polk. These were not average artillerymen. They were mathematicians, engineers, and tacticians operating one of the most complex and dangerous weapons ever fielded by the U.S. Army, the M1 240mm howitzer. Soldiers who served it remembered two things: its size and its sound. The barrel alone stretched nearly 21 feet. Each shell, longer than a man's torso, required a team to load. It took an hour just to emplace the weapon, and every inch of movement had to be measured, leveled, and verified. Mistakes meant misfires. Misfires meant death. Yet there was pride among these artillery crews. They understood what infantrymen whispered behind every attack, every breakthrough, every advance. There was artillery clearing the way. Meanwhile, German defenders waited in their bunkers, cold, exhausted, but still confident. Their officers reminded them the Siegfried Line had been tested by artillery before and survived. The walls were thick, the ceilings reinforced, ammunition stores deep underground. The Allies would bleed here, just as they had at Cassino, Anzio, and Italy's mountainous passes. But what the Germans didn't know was that Monte Cassino had already revealed a new terrifying truth. Even ancient stone and modern concrete were helpless before a weapon designed to shatter fortresses. At Cassino, Fallschirmjäger, some of the toughest soldiers in Europe, reported feeling the ground tremble, as if the mountain itself was collapsing. Walls cracked, doors split, entire rooms vanished in collapsing stone. And now, those same guns were coming to Germany's doorstep. The atmosphere across the American lines shifted the moment the Black Dragons arrived. Engineers laid steel platforms. Tractors maneuvered trailers carrying crates stenciled 240mm He. Forward spotters checked radios. Infantrymen watched in silence. Even seasoned soldiers, men who had seen battles from Sicily to Aachen, paused when they saw the size of the shells being winched from crates. A quiet understanding passed between them. This was different. Behind German lines, fog hung thick over the pillboxes. Some soldiers dozed, others cleaned MG-42s, some wrote letters home insisting the line would hold. But soon they began hearing distant mechanical noises. Tractors, engines, strange metallic clanks. Sounds unfamiliar and unsettling. Then came the silence, the kind before something enormous happens. Radios clicked, spotters whispered coordinates, and somewhere inside a bunker deep beneath earth and reinforced concrete, a German machine gunner suddenly felt the floor tremble. He thought it was distant tank fire. It wasn't. It was the opening breath of artillery unlike anything Europe had ever seen. This was the moment everything was about to change, when engineering met unstoppable force, and when German confidence faced a weapon designed to erase fortresses from history. This was the beginning of the Black Dragon's arrival at the gates of the Reich. When the first fire mission finally came, it didn't arrive with chaos or shouting. It came with cold, calm precision, the kind that spoke of mathematical certainty rather than hope. The forward observer, hidden in the tree line overlooking the Siegfried Line, adjusted his binoculars, exhaled, and quietly transmitted target confirmed. Bunker grid 7-3, fire for effect. On the gun line miles away, crews locked into motion. Powder charge inserted, shell hoisted, breach sealed. The order was spoken like a ritual, fire. The Black Dragon answered with a violent concussion that rolled across the valley like thunder tearing through mountains. A fraction of a second later, the German soldiers inside the bunker heard a strange sound, not a whistle like ordinary artillery, but a deep, descending roar, as if something enormous was falling from the sky. Then impact. The explosion wasn't simply loud, it was physical. The earth convulsed. Dust erupted from ceilings. Metal shelves crashed to the floor. One German officer shouted over the chaos, "Das ist kein Geschütz, das ist ein Erdbeben." That is not artillery, it is an earthquake. The first shot didn't destroy the bunker, but it cracked it, like an eggshell under a hammer. The second round came 30 seconds later, and this time the aftermath was different. The blast ripped open the forward-firing slit, shredding steel armor and turning concrete into fragments that flew like knives. A machine gunner near the embrasure was killed instantly, not by shrapnel but by the pressure wave alone. Outside, observers saw the target shift from structure to ruin. They adjusted fire, 3 meters right, 2 meters forward. Another command, repeat. The third shell hit the bunker directly. There was no dramatic fireball, just the horrifying, unstoppable physics of mass and velocity meeting stone. The roof collapsed, sending tons of concrete downward, crushing ammunition stores, soldiers, and equipment beneath it. Survivors, ears bleeding, faces white with shock, stumbled from the wreckage only to discover the truth. There was no safe direction anymore. The fourth round struck behind them, sealing trenches, flipping equipment, and turning the exit route into a crater 50 feet wide and deep enough to swallow a tank. German communication lines lit up with desperate transmissions. "We cannot hold. The enemy has a new gun." Another voice broke in, panicked and breathless. "The bunker is gone, completely gone." American infantry, watching from a distance, could barely believe the scale of destruction. What hours earlier had been a fortress now looked like a quarry hit by dynamite. The turning point came when an entire defensive sector, designed to hold hundreds, collapsed in less than 10 minutes. German morale shattered long before the concrete did. Units began abandoning fortifications before the shelling even reached them. Some waved white cloths. Others simply ran, leaving weapons behind. One prisoner later confessed to his interrogator, "We did not fear your soldiers. We did not fear your tanks. But that gun made us feel already dead." And still the Black Dragons fired, not recklessly, not wastefully, but with surgical intent. Every bunker that resisted fell. Every hardened position cracked. Every fortress Germany believed eternal was reduced to smoking rubble. As the barrage continued, the Siegfried Line, Hitler's great defensive wall, wasn't breached by infantry, wasn't outmaneuvered by tanks. It was obliterated, piece by piece, until what had once been an engineering marvel became a graveyard of shattered concrete and twisted steel. By the time the guns fell silent, the battlefield was unrecognizable, trenches erased, forests flattened, and fortresses pulverized into gravel. And in that silence, one truth settled like dust on the ruined stone. The moment the Black Dragons roared, Germany's defenses were no longer walls, they were targets. When the final salvo ceased and the smoke blew away with a cold European wind, the battlefield before the Allied troops no longer resembled a fortified line. It looked like the surface of another world. Where once stood bunkers, reinforced gun nests, and proud symbols of German engineering, now there were shattered slabs of concrete jutting from massive craters, twisted steel tangled like broken ribs, and thick layers of dust covering everything as if time itself had chosen to bury the Siegfried Line. The American infantry advanced cautiously at first, expecting resistance. Machine gun fire, mortars, desperate counterattacks. But instead they found silence. Helmets, rifles, ammo crates, and personal items were scattered everywhere, abandoned in chaotic haste. Many German soldiers had fled during the barrage, not waiting for the impossible, surviving another impact. Others lay stunned, wounded or dead, trapped under collapsed roofs or buried in the rubble of their once invincible defenses. Those who surrendered spoke quietly, almost numbly, as if they were still processing what had happened. One German lieutenant, trembling and covered in dust, simply murmured in disbelief, "No wall can stop a country that builds guns like that." Word of what happened traveled fast, first through captured soldiers, then through rumors, and finally through entire armies. Units defending other sectors of the Siegfried Line, upon learning what the Americans had used, began abandoning fortifications before the guns were even brought into range. The psychological effect was enormous. The German belief in the durability of their defenses, something drilled into them for years, cracked like the concrete they hid behind. Battles that planners expected to take weeks or cost thousands of Allied lives now sometimes collapsed in a matter of hours. The U.S. High Command noticed the shift. Infantry casualties dropped dramatically in sectors where the 240mm guns fired. Instead of men fighting room to room or bunker to bunker, many fortifications fell without a single rifle shot fired. The Black Dragon had changed the nature of siege warfare, not by forcing a fight, but by erasing the environment the enemy depended on. For the crews of the 240mm howitzers, the aftermath was complex. They knew their weapon had saved Allied lives, breaking the lethally efficient defensive architecture Germany had built. Yet they also knew exactly what their firepower did. The ground they walked after battles was not just a battlefield, it was a graveyard. Some artillerymen later confessed that watching their shells land, seeing a bunker vanish into smoke and dust, felt like watching the earth swallow men whole. Others, hardened by months of brutal war, viewed it differently. Every bunker smashed was one less hill their brothers had to die taking. The weapon wasn't just metal, it was responsibility. Strategically, the collapse of the Siegfried Line was one of the last major shifts in momentum on the Western Front. Without those fortifications, the Rhine became vulnerable. Once the Rhine was crossed, Germany's industrial heartland, Ruhr steel mills, coal mines, rail hubs lay exposed. And once that fell, Germany's ability to wage war died. Some historians later argued that the 240mm howitzer didn't just break bunkers, it broke time itself, accelerating the end of the war by months. For Germany, the consequences were sobering. The myth of their unbreakable defenses was shattered, and morale plummeted. Field reports showed units retreating faster, surrendering sooner, and resisting less fiercely in fortified regions. Even hardened SS and Fallschirmjäger units began acknowledging that no amount of bravery could survive artillery that could punch through mountains. And for the world, the message lingered long after the last shot was fired. Fortresses, no matter how thick the concrete or how deep the steel, were no longer symbols of safety. The age of castles, bunkers, walls, and immovable defenses had ended. Warfare had evolved, and the M1 240mm howitzer was one of the weapons that forced that evolution into reality. Long after the war, after medals were awarded and the guns were retired, veterans would sometimes speak of that moment, standing on the ruins of a line believed to be eternal. Some described pride, others relief. A few simply shook their heads and whispered, "We didn't just break a wall. We broke a belief." In the end, the story of the Black Dragon isn't just about steel, explosives, and engineering. It's about what humanity learns when confronted with the limits of what it builds and the strength required to overcome those limits. The Siegfried Line was more than concrete. It was a symbol of certainty, a belief that walls and fortifications could decide the fate of nations. Yet when those walls crumbled under the weight of American firepower, it revealed something deeper. Wars are not won only by strength, but by the resolve to innovate, to adapt, and to protect the lives of those who carry the burden of advancing forward. The crews who operated the 240mm howitzer were not celebrated like fighter aces or frontline infantry, but their bravery was measured in patience, precision, and the knowledge that each round they fired spared countless soldiers from storming a bunker by hand. Their work required discipline, teamwork, trust, and the willingness to shoulder a weapon whose power could shape the course of history. And for the infantry who advanced through the shattered remains of once impenetrable defenses, those craters and broken fortresses were more than battlefield scars. They were proof that no obstacle, no matter how permanent it seems, is beyond the reach of determination and sacrifice. This story reminds us that power alone is never the whole story. What makes power meaningful is how it is used. The Black Dragons weren't built to terrorize. They were built to end a war faster, to prevent more deaths, and to bring boys in uniform one step closer to going home. Their legacy isn't destruction, it's the lives saved because infantry didn't have to die clearing bunkers one room at a time. And beyond the battlefield, there's a larger lesson. Even the strongest structures, whether built from concrete or belief, can fall when faced with relentless resolve and unity of purpose. Victory wasn't guaranteed, and neither was survival, yet those who stood beside those guns believed that every shot brought the world closer to peace. So as we look back on the shattered battlements of the Siegfried Line and the weapon that silenced them, the question remains not about the violence, but about meaning. When faced with impossible walls in our own lives, fear, doubt, failure, do we retreat or do we find our own way to fire back, to push forward, to break through? When the thunder finally faded and the smoke drifted away, the Siegfried Line, once the pride of German engineering and the symbol of Hitler's last hope in the West, lay silent, broken, and irrelevant. The 240mm howitzers had not just destroyed bunkers, they had erased the idea that any fortress could stop a determined nation fueled by sacrifice, ingenuity, and purpose. The Americans advanced, casualties fell, and the war's momentum shifted irreversibly toward Allied victory. What stood firm for years had fallen in days, not because the walls were weak, but because the will behind the attack was stronger. In the end, the Black Dragons proved a single truth written into the battlefield and history alike: no wall can stand forever against a force that refuses to stop.